positive matter, ladies and gentlemen, today is going to show you how the proposition's policy is going to contribute to social development of these African countries towards an open democracy and towards human rights, and how we're therefore benefiting the people of Africa. But before I do that, let's just deal with a few issues of rebuttal in terms of what the opposition has brought us this far. Firstly, let's clear a few things up. The opposition are not going to win today's debate by appealing to false statistics to try and prove their arguments. They are going to have to try and rebut the analysis brought forward by proposition, something which they have as yet failed to do. We'd also like to clear up that this debate is not about loans. It's not about aid, developmental or emergency aid. This is about investment, the type of investment that was very clearly stipulated by my first speaker, but something which side opposition don't seem to have understood in today's debate. Right. In terms of rebuttal, what I'm going to deal with is the economic effects on the countries. And in terms of the social effects on the countries, I'll reference how I'm rebutting their matter when I get into my positive matter later in my speech. Right, so let's look at the economic effects on the countries. And the first argument that our opposition made today is that the Western investment in these industries is bad because it takes the resources of Africa. No, thank you. But we'd say that this seems to be an argument against investment as a whole. They haven't proven to us why, if China invests in these industries, they won't also be taking these resources. We'd like to point out that, in fact, at the moment, China owns about 40% of the natural resources in Africa. And we'd like to see how their policy, in terms of resources being owned by a foreign national as opposed to an African country, is at all solved by having Chinese investment. The next rebuttal they had to our case was about labor. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, they're just empirically incorrect. The policy of Chinese foreign investment is to take the labor and take every aspect of that industry with you. They don't actually train the locals when they go in to invest in that industry. And what we say is that in itself disproves the argument about Chinese having the best interest of these countries at heart. If they did, then they wouldn't use any of their own labor. They try to build up the labor force and the skills in this country. The fact is they don't. They're only in it for their personal gain, and we've proven that quite succinctly. No thanks, man. Right. And so what we'd say is that at the moment, where the debate is sitting is very strongly on side proposition. They haven't come onto our terms, they haven't rebutted analysis, and in fact, they haven't given much argumentation which relates to this specific debate. So let's move on then to the positive matter. I said I'm going to be dealing with 2 points. I'm going to be first looking at this issue of influence, and then secondly, I'm going to be looking at the idea of conditional investment, where I'll be rebutting some of the matter that they've brought up thus far. So let's look firstly at influence. And what I'm going to do in this point is I'm going to contrast the amount of influence which the investing country gets over the actions of a government under both policies. Because we contend, and we're going to contend that we're going to get less influence of when there is Western investment in these countries. And we say that's a good thing because it means that the country can better pursue policies only in their own interests and not in the interests of some investing country. So let's look at why we get less investment. And in terms of Western investment, what we see is that when they invest in these industries, we don't actually think there's a real risk of them pulling out of these industries. The West don't actually have a record of using this kind of pull-out. I'll take one of you in a second, as a tool of foreign policy, because in fact they have other options to try and get countries on their side in terms of the international arena. In contrast, China, however, actually does pose a real threat of the pull-out when they invest. We actually know that the general tool of foreign policy China uses is this form of big brinkmanship. We know that when France tried to test this kind of policy, China was willing to cut ties completely with France to show that they meant business. And if they would cut ties with France, we say that definitely there is a threat that they would cut ties with these African countries if they don't do what China wants them to do. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Speaker, are you aware of the fact that China actually accounts for $520 million in Africa FDI?
And what we'd say is that if we could have that as Western investment, we would rather have it as Western investment. That's not an argument. Right. Let's look then. So we don't actually think, we think there's less risk in terms of Western investment. But furthermore, we say that even if there was a risk of them pulling out, that pull-out would have less effect. In terms of the West, we see that because of the nature of Western investment, when they employ laborers in that African country and develop those skills, if they were to pull out, then the industry would still be able to exist. There would be less effect on the economy of that country. In contrast with China, because if they pulled out, they would be pulling out all the laborers and all the skills, that industry would simply collapse and it would have much more of a tangible effect on the country. And so what that means is because there's more risk of Chinese pullout and that pullout would have more effect, the Chinese government would have more influence over the actions of whatever African government we're talking about than we would have if Western governments were making this investment instead. However, even if we were to assume but not concede that this influence would be the same on the part of Western governments or Chinese governments, we say that the Chinese influence is not one that we want. We'd rather have Western influence. And the reason is because these African countries are now going to be aligning their foreign policies and their internal policies with a country like China, which I'll take you in 1 second, that has a terrible human rights record. We'd see, for example, when South Africa denied the entrance, the Dalai Lama entrance into their country because of Chinese pressure only. And we've also seen South Africa voting directly against many what seem to be pro-human rights proposals in the United Nations for this exact reason. And we say we don't want these countries to be moving against the grain of human rights, especially in the context of the African countries that we're talking about. Yes, ma'am?
The onus is on African leaders to ensure they fully benefit from all these opportunities from China.
Not if we can show, ladies and gentlemen, that they benefit from these opportunities in the West. We'd say that we want to be pushing these countries in a direction where they're going to protect human rights because that's best for the people, and that's what South Proposition is doing. Right, let's look then at conditional investment, where I'm going to be directly clashing with their point. And what we'd say is that we don't want a situation where we're okay with African dictators abusing their people, oppressing minorities, and committing an almost genocide in their country. We don't actually think that's a good thing, but we do think that's what South Opposition promotes. In terms of the West, we said that there's two criteria which determine their investment in other countries: the long-term development of that country and the human rights and this country's human rights image in the country. What this means is that in order to protect the long-term investment of the country, Western investment aims to secure stability in the future, stability of the country in the future, so the investment gives them returns. And also, in terms of the human rights image, they aren't going to be wanting to be seen to be promoting a dictator or promoting abuse of human rights. China, on the other hand, don't have either of these concerns to take into account. And so they are going to be promoting human rights abuses, which we don't think is a very good thing for the people in Africa at the moment. And so what I've proven to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're going to contribute to the social development of these people, and we're going to contribute to a culture of human rights and open democracy in these societies, which is what we want. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the motion stands.